The vote was not close. It never was going to be. 847 council members raised their signal stones. And only one, a small, gray-feathered delegate from the Vehari cluster, kept her hand down. She sat in the back row of the Grand Galactic Assembly Hall, her black eyes scanning the crowd. Her feathers pulled tight against her body the way birds do when they feel cold or afraid. She was not cold. She was terrified of what she had just watched the galaxy do. The hall was enormous. It stretched across 3 levels, carved from a single asteroid that had been hollowed out over 2,000 years ago. Delegates from 847 species filled its curved seats. Some had 6 limbs. Some had none. Some communicated through color changes in their skin, and others through low-frequency vibrations that only certain species could feel in their chest bones. And yet, despite all this difference, all this variety of life and thought and culture, they had all agreed on one thing without much debate. Humanity had to go. The charge list was long. Humans had been a member of the Galactic Union for only 60 years, which, in galactic terms, was about the same as walking into a party and immediately spilling a drink on the host. In those 60 years, they had done the following: colonized 11 star systems without asking anyone first, developed 3 separate weapons technologies that were banned under the Kareth Accords, started a trade dispute that accidentally collapsed the economy of an entire species, and most famously, launched an unmanned probe directly into the sacred migration corridor of the Alundi, a spiritual civilization that had been traveling that corridor for 40,000 years without interruption. That last one had nearly caused a war. The Alundi delegate rose from his seat after the vote and read the Exile Declaration in his low, resonant voice. Under the terms of the declaration, humanity would be relocated to a region of space called the Fringe, a stretch of dark, mostly empty territory beyond the outer arms of the galaxy. No trade routes crossed it. No communication relays reached it. The stars there were old and dim. There were no other civilizations within 40 light-years in any direction. It was in the most precise and deliberate sense of the word, nowhere. Humanity would be given 6 months to comply. Their existing colonies would be absorbed into the Union. Their ships would be escorted to the Fringe boundary, and then the Union would close the relay network behind them. That would be that. On Earth, the reaction was not what the Council had expected. There was anger, yes. Protests filled the streets of dozens of cities. Politicians gave speeches about injustice. A few rogue factions threatened retaliation, though nobody with any real power took those seriously. But underneath all the noise, something quieter was happening. Engineers were already at their desks. Scientists were pulling up old files. Military planners were staring at maps of the Fringe with expressions that were not afraid, but focused. The Union had made a very specific assumption when it drafted the Exile Declaration. It had assumed that the Fringe was punishment because it was empty. No resources. No allies. No infrastructure. No support. Just darkness and silence in the distant cold light of dying stars. What the Union did not know what it had never bothered to learn. Because learning about humanity in detail had never seemed important enough, was that humans did not experience emptiness the way other species did. Most civilizations, when placed in an empty space, became less. They contracted. They preserved what they had and waited. They were, at their core, conservative creatures who had built their societies on stability and the maintenance of what existed. The Union itself was a perfect example of this. It had not explored a new star system in over 300 years. It managed what it had. It optimized. It refined. It did not go looking for trouble or possibility. Humans, by deep evolutionary and cultural design, did the opposite. Dr. Lena Vasquez was 34 years old and worked for the Earth Geological and Exoplanetary Survey when the Exile Declaration was announced. She had spent the previous 4 years cataloging uninhabited moons in the outer solar system, a job that most people found extremely boring and that she found extremely peaceful. When her supervisor called her into his office and showed her the first survey maps of the fringe that Union cartographers had shared as part of the relocation briefing, she leaned over the desk, looked at the maps for about 45 seconds, and said something that would later become famous in certain circles. She said, "They haven't looked below the surface of anything here." Her supervisor blinked. "What do you mean?" "These are orbital surveys, atmospheric scans, electromagnetic readings, gravitational mapping. It's all surface-level analysis, 100 years old at minimum." She pointed to a cluster of planets near what the maps labeled as Fringe Sector 7. These 4 planets are in a binary star system. The tidal forces alone would create enormous geothermal activity. The internal heat, the mineral compression, the potential for subsurface liquid oceans. She straightened up and crossed her arms. They looked at this place and saw nothing, because they were looking for what they already had. They weren't looking for what could be built. Within 3 weeks of the Exile declaration, Dr. Vasquez had assembled a team of 200 geologists, chemists, and materials engineers. Within 2 months, she had secured funding from 3 separate Earth governments and a private consortium. Within 4 months, before humanity had even reached the fringe, she had a construction blueprint for what she was calling Anchor Station 1. Meanwhile, in a different building, on a different continent, a man named Commander Darius Okafor was doing something the Union would later describe in internal documents as deeply alarming in retrospect. He was redesigning the human fleet. The ships assigned to humanity for the relocation were old, Union standard vessels, efficient and reliable, built to carry large populations across long distances without breaking down. They were, in every technical sense, adequate. Okafor looked at them and saw raw material. He had spent his career in deep space military operations, and he had a particular talent for understanding what ships were really capable of beyond their listed specifications. He began modifying the vessels almost immediately, not to make them faster or better armed, but to make them modular, reconfigurable, adaptable, ships that could be broken apart and reassembled into different configurations depending on what a situation required. His engineers worked in shifts. They welded, rewired, and restructured. They replaced fixed components with interchangeable systems. They built manufacturing bays into cargo holds and converted observation decks into research laboratories. By the time the human fleet reached the fringe boundary and the Union relay network went dark behind them, something that had not existed before. The Vehari delegate, whose name was Siravos, watched the fleet disappear through her personal observation screen. She had been the only one to vote against the Exile, not because she liked humans particularly, but because she had read their history. All of it, every war, every collapse, every rebuilding. She had noticed a pattern that nobody else on the council seemed to find interesting. Humans did not just survive hard things. They used hard things. Every disaster in their history had produced a transformation. Every exile, every loss, every moment when everything seemed to close in around them had resulted in something new emerging from the pressure. She filed a formal advisory notice with the council. The day after the vote, it was 2 pages long and ended with a single sentence that the council secretary later admitted nobody had read carefully. The sentence said, "We are not removing a problem from our galaxy. We are compressing one." The council moved on to other business, trade disputes, diplomatic negotiations, the routine maintenance of a galaxy that had not changed in any meaningful way for 3 centuries. They did not think about humanity again for almost 2 years. By the time they did, it was because something in the fringe had started showing up on their deep space sensors. Something large. something that was growing very fast, and something that was moving, slowly but unmistakably, back in their direction. The first thing humanity built in the Fringe was not a home. It was a forge. Dr. Lena Vasquez had been right about Sector 7. The 4 planets in the binary star system were geologically violent in the most useful possible way. Tidal forces from the twin suns had cracked the mantles of all 4 worlds, pushing mineral-rich magma to within a few kilometers of the surface in dozens of locations. The subsurface pressure was enormous. The heat output was consistent and enormous and completely free. It was, for anyone willing to look at it correctly, one of the most energy-rich environments in the known galaxy. The Union's cartographers had labeled it geologically unstable, inhabitable, risk level extreme, and moved on. Vasquez labeled it perfect and started drilling. Her team worked without rest cycles for the first 90 days. They sank thermal extraction shafts into the crust of the largest planet, which they named Foundry. The heat they pulled out powered their equipment. The minerals they extracted from the drill cores fed their fabrication units. Within 4 months of arriving in the Fringe, they were producing raw processed metals at a rate that surprised even Vasquez's most optimistic projections. Within 6 months, they had smelted enough structural alloy to begin construction on Anchor Station 1. It was not a beautiful structure. Nobody had time to make it beautiful. It was a platform. It's a massive hexagonal platform, anchored above the planet's upper atmosphere on a network of tethering cables and stabilization thrusters. It was functional and dense and covered in docking ports and construction bays and antennae. It looked exactly like what it was, a machine for making more things. But it worked. And it worked faster than anything the Union had ever built. Because it had been designed by people who had nothing and needed everything, and that particular combination of conditions tends to produce a certain kind of engineering genius that comfort and stability never quite manages. Commander Darius. Okafor arrived at Foundry 3 weeks after the platform went active. He brought 17 of his modified ships with him and immediately docked them at the construction bays. He had spent the months since leaving Earth developing something that had no name yet in any galactic language, because no species had ever needed to invent the concept before. He called it, informally, a snap build system. The idea was simple and radical at the same time. Instead of designing ships as single integrated objects that needed to be built from scratch each time, his system treated ships as collections of standardized modules that could be manufactured separately and assembled in parallel, then snapped together in configurations that matched whatever was needed. He walked Vasquez through the schematics on the platforms. Central deck. She looked at the designs for about 3 minutes and then looked up at him. You can build a full-size exploration vessel in how long? 42 days, he said, with 2 construction bays running simultaneously. She looked back at the schematics. And a cargo hauler? 19 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're going to need a lot more construction bays." Okafor smiled. "No. That's why I'm here." Meanwhile, in the civilian population centers that had been established on 3 of the Fringe's more stable planets, something less planned but equally important was taking root. The Exile had arrived with its full weight. People had lost their homes. They had left behind the infrastructure of centuries. Children were growing up in prefabricated shelters. Food was grown under artificial lights. The sky above their new worlds was the wrong color, and the stars at night were unfamiliar. And the silence of the Fringe pressed against every settlement like something physical. But humans, as any honest historian of the species will tell you, are deeply uncomfortable with silence, and they are pathologically bad at accepting limitations as permanent. A woman named Yuki Tanaka had been a network engineer on Earth, responsible for maintaining the communication infrastructure of one of Earth's largest city clusters. In the Fringe, with no relay network and no Union communication satellites, she found herself in a situation that would have paralyzed most people. She found it motivating instead. She had arrived with a small team and 3 shipping containers, full of components she had pulled from decommissioned Earth systems before departure. In the first year, she built a local communication mesh that connected all 17 human settlements in the Fringe. It was low bandwidth and occasionally unreliable, but it worked. In the second year, she extended it using relay buoys that Oakhofer's construction base had produced at her request. In the third year, she was doing something that had no precedent in Union technology. She was building a faster-than-light communication network from scratch, using principles she had developed by studying how the Union's own relay system functioned from the outside, reverse engineering it through observation and deduction. Because she had never been given access to its actual specifications, the Union's relay network had taken 400 years to build. Tanaka was reconstructing its core principles in 3 years because she had no other option, and because the human brain, when it has no other option, becomes something remarkable. Back in the Union's central systems, the Council was not paying attention to the fringe. This was partly because nothing interesting had ever happened in the fringe before, partly because the Council had other things to worry about. There were always other things to worry about. A long-running trade dispute between the Murithi and the Corvin species had escalated into something resembling a blockade. 3 Union member species were experiencing internal political crises. The Ulundi were filing a formal grievance about a new mining operation near their migration corridor, different from the human one, but similar enough to reopen old wounds. The Council was busy. Suravas, the Vehari delegate, was not busy. Or rather, she was busy with something that none of her colleagues considered important. She had begun monitoring the deep space sensor feeds from the Fringe Boundary Relay, the last active Union sensor in that direction. For the first 18 months, it showed nothing unusual. Empty space. Background radiation. The occasional passing rock. Then, in the 19th month, it began showing something else. Heat signatures. Electromagnetic activity. Structured radio emissions, faint, but clearly artificial. The frequencies typically associated with industrial scale fabrication. She brought it to the Council's attention at the next full session. The response was polite and uninterested. One of the senior delegates told her that some residual activity from the relocation process was expected and would fade over time. Another suggested the sensors might need recalibration. A third didn't look up from the document he was reviewing. Servas submitted a formal request for a reconnaissance mission to the fringe boundary. It was reviewed, approved at a low priority level, and assigned to a small Union survey vessel that happened to be in the area. The vessel reached the boundary 14 months later. What its crew saw when their long-range sensors reached into the darkness of the fringe stopped every one of them from speaking for nearly 30 seconds. There were structures, enormous ones. Anchor Station 1 had grown into something that could no longer be described as a station. It was a complex now. A sprawling network of platforms and docking rings and construction scaffolding that extended across nearly 40 kilometers. Around it, in orbits that had been calculated with extraordinary precision, 17 new ships were moving in formation. Ships of a design that matched nothing in the Union's registry. They were angular and modular and dense with purpose, and they were clearly not finished. More sections were being attached as the survey vessel watched. Below the complex, the planet they were calling Foundry glowed faintly, with the heat of a civilization in the process of building itself, and on the sensor screen, spread across the surrounding light years, the crew of the survey vessel could count 14 other points of industrial activity, each one generating heat and electromagnetic radiation at levels that suggested significant ongoing construction. The survey vessel's captain transmitted a report back to the Union immediately. It took 14 months for the report to arrive, because there were no relay buoys at the fringe boundary anymore. They had been removed when humanity was exiled. But the captain sent it anyway, and then sat in her command chair for a long time, looking at the sensor readings, doing simple arithmetic in her head. Humanity had been in the fringe for less than 3 years. In that time, working with no Union support, established infrastructure, and no external resources. They had built what the sensor data suggested was the foundation of a fully independent industrial civilization. Not the beginning of one, the foundation, the base layer from which everything else would grow. She pulled up the original Exile declaration on her screen and read through it slowly. The document was confident and detailed and very thoroughly explained why the fringe was an appropriate punishment for a species that had caused so much disruption to the galactic order. It used words like containment and isolation and reduction of capacity. It had been written by 847 of the galaxy's most experienced diplomatic and political minds. It had not once used the word underestimation, but that, the captain thought, was exactly the right word. That was the word that would define what came next. The survey vessel's report arrived at the Union Council Hall on a Tuesday, which was not a significant detail, except that the Council happened to be in a full session that day reviewing the Maratha-Corvin trade blockade. The report was flagged priority medium by the routing system, which meant it sat in a queue for 11 days before anyone read it in full. The person who finally read it was a junior analyst named Tevsoren, a young Harati with 4 eyes and the kind of careful, methodical mind that makes excellent analysts and terrible politicians. He read the report twice. Then he pulled the sensor data files and examined them directly. Then he did something his supervisors later described as unusually proactive. He pulled every piece of public information available about human industrial and engineering history and spent 4 days reading it before he wrote his assessment. His assessment was 47 pages long. Most assessments in the Union were 3 to 5 pages. His supervisor received it, noticed its length, and skimmed the executive summary. The summary said, in careful and precise language, that the Union had made a serious miscalculation and that the Council should convene an emergency session to discuss what was happening in the fringe, before it became something that couldn't be discussed calmly. The supervisor passed it up the chain with a note that said the analyst might be overreacting. It reached Suravos 6 days later. She read all 47 pages in a single sitting. Then she went to the senior council chamber and asked for floor time. She got 15 minutes at the end of a very long day. When most delegates were tired and ready to leave, she stood at the speaker's podium and put the sensor data on the main display. She showed them what the survey vessel had recorded. She showed them the heat signatures and the construction activity and the fleet of new ships that matched no known Union classification. She showed them the spread of industrial sites across 14 locations in the fringe. She showed them the timeline. 3 years. All of this in 3 years. The chamber was quiet when she finished. Then the senior delegate from the Corvin species said, carefully, these readings could be misinterpreted. The instruments were at long range. Servos looked at him. The instruments were functioning correctly. I had them independently verified. Even so, said another delegate, a Marathi with iridescent scales that shifted color slightly when he was uncomfortable, which they were doing now. The scale here seems implausible. For a species with no infrastructure, no supply chains, they built the infrastructure, said Suravos. That is exactly my point. They built all of it from the planetary resources of the fringe, which we dismissed as useless. We dismissed those resources because we never looked at them carefully. Humans looked carefully. Long silence followed. Nobody wanted to be the first to say the obvious thing, so Suravos said it for them. We sent them to an empty region of space as a punishment. They treated it as a construction site. And now they have a fleet of ships we cannot identify, a communication network we did not give them, and an industrial base that is, by all the metrics our sensor data can measure, growing faster than anything in the Union has grown in 300 years. I am asking this council to take this seriously before we are required to take it seriously. She got a task force. It was not a large task force, and it was not given emergency authority, but it was something. Its official mandate was to assess the long-term implications of fringe development activity, which was diplomatic language for figuring out what humanity was actually doing and whether it was a problem. Tevsoren was assigned to it, which Suravos had specifically requested. So was a Union military strategic advisor named Commander Vithoro, a large, heavily armored Drahari with a reputation for blunt analysis and very little patience for optimistic assumptions. Vethru reviewed the fleet data first. He pulled up the sensor images of Okafor's new ships and examined them for a very long time. His assessment, delivered verbally at the task force's first meeting, was characteristically direct. These are not exploration vessels, he said. The mass distribution is wrong for pure exploration. The docking configurations suggest modular weapon integration points. The whole geometry is optimized for rapid direction changes in confined spaces, which is not useful for deep space travel, but is very useful in asteroid fields or close-quarters engagement scenarios. He paused. Whoever designed these was thinking about fighting, or at minimum about the option of fighting. They designed the option in. The room was quiet. Then one of the civilian analysts said, carefully, we should consider that they may have designed those features defensively. Given that they were exiled, I understand why they designed them, Vitharu said. I am not questioning their motivation. I am noting that a species we exiled 3 years ago, with nothing but old cargo ships now possesses, a fleet whose tactical profile I cannot dismiss. That is the relevant fact. Back in the Fringe, nobody was thinking about the Union's task force, because nobody in the Fringe knew it existed. What humanity was thinking about was a problem that had emerged in the second year and grown steadily more complicated since the Fringe was not. In fact, uninhabited. Not entirely. 2 survey teams exploring the outer edges of Sector 12 had independently encountered the same thing within 6 months of each other. Ruins, old ones. Very old, carved into the surfaces of a series of dead moons that orbited a cold brown dwarf. The ruins were not large and they were not dramatic, but they were clearly artificial. The geometric precision of the carved channels, repeating structural patterns, the trace chemical signatures of processed materials in the stone, none of it was natural. Something had been here before. Something had built here long ago, then stopped. Vasquez diverted to full geology teams to the moons and requested 3 xenorchaeologists from the civilian settlement population. A field so obscure in the Fringe that she found exactly for people with relevant training, and one of them was technically a hobbyist. They went to work regardless. What they found over the following 8 months was not a dead civilization. It was a dormant one. The ruins were not the remains of buildings. They were the exposed surfaces of something much larger, a network of structures that extended deep into the moon's interiors. Shielded by hundreds of meters of rock that had accumulated over millions of years. The structures were intact. The materials they were made from were unlike anything in the human materials database, or in the Union's published research for that matter. Dense, dark, extraordinarily resistant to both physical and thermal stress. And inside some of the deepest chambers, sealed behind doors that required months of careful work to open without damaging them, there were devices. Small, rectangular, flat. Clearly designed to be held in a hand, though what kind of hand was uncertain. Covered in script that no human had ever seen. Dr. Amara Osei, one of the 3 qualified xenorchaeologists, sat in a pressurized shelter on the surface of the largest moon and held one of the devices in her gloved hands and understood, with the quiet certainty that comes from years of training, that she was holding something of extraordinary significance. She did not know what the script said. She did not know what the devices did. She did not know what civilization had left them here or why. In the most deliberately overlooked region of the galaxy, a civilization had built something it apparently intended to last. What she knew was that the Union had been patrolling this galaxy for thousands of years and had never found this. And humanity had been in the Fringe for less than 3 years. She wrote up her preliminary report and sent it through Tanaka's communication network to Vasquez and Okafor and the heads of the civilian settlements. She included photographs. She included her analysis of the material composition. She included a note at the end that was not formal scientific language, but that she felt was necessary. It said, "Whatever this is, it did not end. It was waiting. And I think we should understand what it was waiting for before we tell anyone else it exists." Vasquez read the report at 0300 hour station time. She sat with it for a long while, the shelter quiet around her, the dim stars of the Fringe visible through the viewport. Then she forwarded it to Okafor with a single line added at the bottom. She wrote, "Don't tell the Union." It was not a permanent decision. It was a delay, a space to understand before being understood. But it was the moment when humanity's situation in the Fringe, stopped being a story about survival and became something with a much longer arc. The Union Task Force sent its first direct communication to human-held space in the 4th year after the Exile. It was not a diplomatic message. It was a sensor ping, standard identification request of the kind Union vessels sent to any unregistered structure or ship they encountered. The ping was directed at Anchor Station 1, now a complex so large that it registered on long-range sensors as something resembling a small moon. Yuki? Tanaka received the ping before anyone else, because her communication network was designed to catch exactly this kind of signal. She traced it to its point of origin, which was a Union survey vessel positioned at the very edge of the fringe boundary, 112 light-minutes away. She sat at her console for a moment, looked at the signal's encoding structure, and then did something methodical and deliberate. She decoded the Union identification protocol down to its base structure, built a response format that was technically compliant with Union communication standards, and sent back a reply. The reply said, in the Union's primary diplomatic language, that the structures detected were the legal property of the Fringe Human Authority, established under emergency sovereignty declaration following forced exile, and that any vessel wishing to make contact should submit a formal approach request. It included a contact frequency and a response window of 72 Union Standard Hours. The survey vessel's crew was not prepared for that. They had expected silence, or primitive signals, or possibly distress calls. They had not expected a reply in fluent Union diplomatic protocol that cited sovereignty law and gave them a contact window. The captain transmitted the exchange back to the task force immediately and requested guidance. Guidance took 3 weeks to arrive, because the relay network between the boundary and the core systems was old and slow, and nobody had thought to update it since humanity was exiled. In those 3 weeks, Tanaka sent 3 follow-up messages to the survey vessel. Each one was polite, professional, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The third one included navigational data for a safe approach route to a designated meeting point near the fringe boundary. Offered in the spirit of facilitating productive dialogue, the task force convened an emergency session. When all of this arrived simultaneously, Survos was present. So was Vitharu and Tevsorin and 11 other analysts and advisors, who had been quietly building increasingly alarming models of fringe development over the previous months. The room had the particular quality of a space where everyone present knows something important is happening, and nobody wants to be the one who says it first. Vitharu said it first, because that was his nature. They have a government, he said. A functional one. The response used sovereignty language correctly and precisely. You don't produce that in an improvised situation. Someone drafted legal frameworks. Someone established institutional authority. They have been governing themselves in the fringe with enough structure to produce formal diplomatic communication on 72 hours' notice. He looked around the table. We exiled a disorganized collection of colonies, and they've become a state with an industrial base, a fleet, a communication network, and apparently a foreign policy. Nobody argued with him. The formal meeting took place at the designated boundary point 68 days later. 3 Union diplomatic vessels arrived with a full task force delegation. 2 human ships were already there when they came out of transit. The human ships were everything Vitharu's analysis had predicted: angular, modular, dense with purpose, and carrying what his tactical sensors identified as weapon integration points in the standby position, which meant they were installed but not active. The message that carried was precise and deliberate. We're choosing not to, today. The human delegation was led by Commander Darius Okafor, who had transferred his role from fleet construction to something that could be described as a combination of military commander and chief negotiator. He came aboard the Union flagship with 3 advisors, shook hands with the task force lead in the human fashion, which briefly unsettled several delegates who were not accustomed to direct physical greeting, and sat down at the table. His opening statement was very short. He said that the fringe human authority was not seeking conflict, was not seeking revenge, and was not seeking to rejoin the Union on the Union's terms. He said humanity had spent 4 years building a civilization in space that the Union had provided as punishment, and had found it adequate for their purposes. He said the FHA was prepared to discuss terms of mutual recognition and limited trade, but that any discussion of reabsorption into the Union, under previous conditions, was not a conversation they would be having. The task force lead, a senior diplomat named Velarani from the Harati species, looked at Okafor carefully. She had read Tev Soren's 47-page assessment and every update since. She was prepared to be surprised. She said, "You're asking for recognition as a sovereign entity," Okafor said. "We're informing you that we are one. Recognition is something we'd appreciate, but we are a sovereign entity regardless of whether you recognize it." The silence that followed was informative. Several delegates shifted in their seats. Vitharu, who was present as an observer, did not shift. He had expected exactly this. What followed over the next 6 days of negotiation was a delicate and complicated process, but not a violent one, because humanity had done the one thing that the Union had never anticipated, and that made violence an unappealing option for everyone. They had made themselves necessary. The industrial capacity in the fringe was producing materials and components at rates and in configurations that the Union's own production systems, optimized for efficiency rather than innovation, could not easily match. Okafor's modular ship construction system had already produced vessel designs that outperformed Union standards in 3 specific technical categories. And Tanaka's communication network, built from scratch in 4 years, incorporated relay efficiency improvements that Union engineers were looking at, with expressions that were professionally neutral but personally fascinated. The FHA had not come to the table with weapons deployed. They had come with a catalog of things the Union needed and couldn't build itself. On the 5th day, Saravis arrived at the meeting. She had not been part of the official task force delegation, but had insisted on observing the final sessions. She sat in the gallery and watched Okafor work. He was not angry. None of the human delegation were angry, which was something she had thought carefully about. Anger would have been understandable. The exile had not been fair. 847 species had voted to remove humanity from the galaxy because they were inconvenient and unpredictable and too energetic for an institution that had spent 3 centuries doing the same things in the same ways. Instead of anger, the humans had brought output. Overwhelming, relentless, staggering output. For years of it, the answer to Exile had been to build so much, so fast, so well, that coming back to the table was inevitable. On the last day of negotiations, an agreement was initialed. The fringe human authority was formally recognized as a sovereign entity with territorial rights to fringe sectors. 1 through 15. Trade agreements were established. A communication relay upgrade was authorized, jointly funded, using Tanaka's design. The Union military advisory position was officially notified that the FHA fleet was to be treated as a peer force. Not a threat, but definitely not to be miscounted. There was one thing Okafor did not put on the table. He said nothing about the ruins on the moons of Sector 12. He said nothing about the devices or the script, though Dr. Osei's ongoing work, which had, over the course of 4 years, produced the first partial translation of the text. The translation was incomplete and uncertain in places, but its broad meaning was clear enough. The civilization that had built those structures had not died. It had hidden. It had hidden from something large enough and threatening enough to require hiding for millions of years, and in the text of the deepest chamber, repeated in what appeared to be an instructional format, was something that Osei had translated cautiously as either a warning or an invitation. Depending on which grammatical interpretation you accepted, it said, "When those who were sent away return changed, the door opens." Nobody in the Union knew this. Nobody outside the FHA knew this. Vasquez had held to her instinct from that early morning 4 years ago. Understand before being understood. The door, whatever it was, wherever it led, would not open on anyone else's schedule. Survas left the negotiations on the last day and walked to the viewport on the Union flagship's observation deck. The fringe was visible from there, just barely, a region of space that looked darker and emptier than what surrounded it. She stood there for a while. Then she pulled up the advisory notice she had filed 4 years ago, the one nobody had read carefully, and added a single line to her personal copy of it. The line said, "They have not shown us everything. They will not show us everything. They will show us what they decide to show us, on their schedule." For their reasons, she saved the document and put it away and looked out at the dark region of space where the galaxy's most inconvenient. Species had gone to be forgotten, and had instead become something the galaxy would spend a very long time trying to understand. The door, wherever it was